Same field, fresh graves, new victims. That's pretty much the English version of what is happening in our small town in Daejeon, South Korea. Well, they say it in Korean, but roughly translated it means same field, fresh graves, new victims. 6 months ago, my neighbor who lived across the street passed away. He was by far the wealthiest person in our neighborhood and had the nicest house along with the biggest plot of land, but he never acted like he had a lot of money. Honestly, it felt like he used more money on others than he used on himself, but that's just the type of person he was. He was over 80 years old, but he was probably the most active person in our neighborhood. Every morning he would walk around our area a couple of times and then go up the small mountain. Sometimes he would stop by my house and leave me a couple of herbs he found. I never really ate anything he brought me, but I really did appreciate the gesture. Almost everyone loved him. Hell, even the kids that lived in the neighborhood would run out of their houses whenever they saw him walking by their house because they knew he had a little snack for them. That is why we were all completely shocked when he died of a heart attack. Yes, he was older, but he seemed completely healthy. It was especially sad when the day of his funeral came. His entire family lived in Seoul, about 3 hours away, and none of them took the time to show up. There were 12 people at his funeral, and I felt like none of us really knew who he was. Well, I didn't. It really embarrasses me to say this, but I didn't even know his real name until the priest said it during the funeral. We all called him Uncle Dan, but his real name was Hayong. After he died, we all wondered who was going to take his property. His son stopped by the house about 2 weeks after the funeral and talked to a man in a gray suit. 2 days later, a for sale sign was placed in front of the house. It really was a nice house, and it had plenty of land, which is really hard to find in Korea, but the price was more than anyone was willing to pay. After around 3 months of the house being unsold, the abandoned lawn, trees, and bushes started to look like a small forest. It was an eyesore for everyone that drove or walked past, but there really wasn't anything we could do about it. Soon we learned to ignore it and just continue on with our day. Life went back to normal, and Uncle Dan was the furthest thing from my mind until 3 days ago. Sunday morning, while I was leaving my house, I noticed that Uncle Dan's property looked the way it did when he was alive. The trees were trimmed, the grass was cut evenly, and the bushes looked immaculate. There were even a couple of flowers that weren't there before. Curious, I walked across the street and tried to see if anyone moved into the house, but it was completely dark inside the house, and the for sale sign was still up. There was a small patch of dirt in the middle of the yard right behind the sign. I figured the real estate agent or his son hired someone to clean the house up. After I was done looking at the house, I walked to the grocery store and picked up a couple of necessities. After walking in that god-awful heat, all I really wanted was to go home, drink a couple of beers, and fall asleep while watching random shit on the TV. However, the closer I got to my house, the more voices I could hear coming from the distance. As I got near my house, I could see that there was a group of people standing in front of Uncle Dan's house. When I got to the house, I walked into the middle of the crowd and saw that there were 4 police officers standing next to 2 men digging in the patch of dirt I saw earlier. It didn't take long for the diggers to find what they were looking for. The cops walked towards us and ordered us to leave at once. Reluctantly, we walked away from the house. When I got back into my house, I sat on my couch in the living room and watched as the officers dismissed the 2 diggers and waited around. Around 20 minutes later, it got dark outside, but I could see an ambulance and a fire truck stop in front of the house. The paramedics dragged a body out of the hole and placed it on the gurney. After a couple of minutes, the paramedics placed a white sheet over the body and rolled the gurney into the back of the ambulance and drove away. I've never been a person that was interested in dead people. Honestly, it really freaks the fuck out of me, especially when it was right in front of my house. But I needed to know what happened. Luckily, 3 hours later the news covered the story. A 22-year-old college student went missing the night before. She was last seen at a popular bar around 3 kilometers away from my house. Her friends were with her at the bar, but they all have said that she wasn't with them when they decided to leave. Her body was the one they dug up from the ground. The thing that is complicating the investigation the most is the fact that there was absolutely nothing wrong with her physically. They were still trying to find out who did it, but there really weren't any leads. On Monday morning, I was woken up by the sound of voices coming from outside of my house. I got up and walked to the living room and looked out the window to see more cops and paramedics standing outside of the house across the street. A crowd of people gathered around the house again, but just like the day before, the cops told them to leave. I had plenty of vacation days left at work, so I took 3 days off and told my boss that I had some family problems I had to take care of. By 1 p.m., paramedics took out 2 bodies from the holes. It looked like 2 men, but this time there were clear signs of physical damage. Both of their cheeks were torn open, and their jaws were barely hanging onto the face. Empty bottles of soju, Korean liquor, were jammed down their throats. About an hour after the paramedics and police officers left, an emergency alert came up on my phone. It was in Korean, but one of my coworkers sent me the translated version. Do not leave your house at night unless it is an emergency. If you are not expecting anyone and you hear a knock on the door, please notify the police. If you were expecting someone, please try to verify that the person is the one you were expecting. Around 5, the news finally covered the story. 3 coworkers were hanging out and drinking at one of their houses. They had been drinking all night long, and it was close to 8 in the morning when they heard a knock on the door. The owner of the house got up and answered the door. After a couple of seconds, they noticed he was starting to sound more and more frustrated. The other voice was far too quiet for any of them to hear. When he started to scream at whatever was on the other side of the door, one of the other guys walked towards the front door to see what was going on. The man that stayed in the living room was the only one that didn't die. He told the officers when the second man walked up to the door, everything went quiet. That's when he got up and walked to the front door. The door was wide open, but his coworkers were gone. I will admit it, I was fucking scared. I woke up at 8:15 and they were already taking out their bodies. How the fuck did they get buried in less than 15 minutes? There weren't any new graves yesterday morning, but there was a large cross in the middle of the lawn. The officers took the cross down and didn't leave the house. They got in the cop car and waited. They were there all night long. I know because I was sitting on my couch and staring out the window all night long as well. Nothing happened until around 7 in the morning. A spot in the yard started to bulge out slightly in 3 spots. It went down after a couple of seconds, but the grass disappeared where the bulges were. The cop on the passenger side slowly got out of the car and walked up to one of the spots. He knelt down and stayed like that for a second before he tried to get up, but I noticed that he was sinking. His partner jumped out of the car and tried to help him get out of it, but he started sinking next to him. They started to scream, and it took everything out of me to not run out and try to help them out. I didn't want to occupy the 3rd freshly made grave. The person that lived to the right side of Uncle Dan's house ran out with a cell phone up to his ear. He was just wearing his boxers, but I couldn't blame him since he probably saw the same thing I did. He was waving his arms around and walked up and down the street in front of the house as he talked on the phone. As he hung up the phone, his body jerked forward as if someone pushed him. He turned around and started to scream. He raised his fist and punched at air. he tried punching at the air again when he fell face first onto the ground. He started to struggle, but the skin on the middle of his back started to rip open. I could hear him scream out in pure agony. As his body was dragged on the ground towards the last unused grave, his body slowly continued to split down the middle. His body sank into the grave in 2 separate halves. I want to get the fuck out of here and get as far away as possible, but I am honestly too scared to leave the house now. That's why I'm writing to you guys. I don't really have anyone else to talk to, and honestly, I'm guessing it's only a matter of time before it gets me. I hear knocking on my door. I looked out of the peephole, and there isn't anyone there. Every time it knocks, it gets louder.